Hello and welcome back, everybody, to continuing coverage of YETICON 2022. My name is Corey Hansen, member of the Rocky Mountain Yetis Old School Magic Club, hosting this event on November 19th, 2022 in Lakewood, Colorado. This is a round 4 matchup between 2 and 1 competitors, Dan Cowling on the left playing a deck called Titania's Fox, and Brian Urbano on the right, who is playing a Mishra's Workshop build called What's in Urbano. Brian Urbano would go on to win our orb flipping competition. Congratulations, Brian. Let's jump on over to game number 1 and see how things shake out. Game number 1 between these two competitors. Here we have Dan Cowling on the left has their hand down, and Brian taking a look at the hand as well. Brian on the right-hand side there with the darker playmat. Brian taking a mulligan here in game 1. Unfortunate, but looks like Dan's going to get started. That's a scrubland into a Savannah Lion. So pretty cool. No Titania yet. I believe that's a scrubland. Maybe it's a Savannah. It's hard to tell with the lighting here in the bar, as you can see. On Brian's side, we have a Tundra and a Pearl. Pretty good start for Brian Urbano. And here Brian attempting to put the camera or the phone into the camera range, but unfortunately because of the lighting in the bar there, the phone shows up as a blur. So Brian, thank you for trying to be a bud there, but I'm just going to put the life totals over that because the camera wasn't able to pick it up because we were in a darker corner of the brewery. Meanwhile, Brian takes an Ancestral. Pretty nice early start here. Draws 3. And is going to play down a Ruby. Plenty of mana on Brian's side. There's a Factory. All right, very cool. So we have 2 Lions, though. Lots of pressure on the side of Dan. That Factory was timely because it's going to hold back at least one of the Lions. There's a Maze of Ith on the side of Dan. Dan is going to announce attack. We have a block on 1 Lion, and Dan goes for the trade. Instead of using the Maze to save the Lion, goes for the trade. Probably a good play there because, of course, after this, the Factory is going to be not summoning sick and can pump itself. So now's the time to get that Factory off the board. Brian does take that trade, and so we have 1 Lion remaining. Felwar Stone on Brian's side. And, a big Mind Twist right here. Those can be hard to come back from. So let's see what Dan is going to get to keep. And he's going to, looks like it's a Mind Twist for 2 after that. Okay, Mind Twist for 2. Looks like lost a Sarah Angel. Ooh, unfortunate. So that would have been a nice one to have in a couple more turns with some more mana. There is an Emerald and an attack from the Lion. So Brian down to 14, from 16 down to 14. So the pressure is definitely still on Dan's side, although the Factory from Brian is going to be keeping back the Lions now, unless we can get rid of that. There is a Mishra's Workshop, tapping 4 mana, and there's a Book. So pretty nice. Book is not quite online to draw, or it is online to draw just yet. Yep, unless the Lions cause a forced tap on that Factory. So that's something to think about. He could have him short of mana if he uses the Maze of Ith. Looks like he's announcing attack, and we do have an activation of the Factory, and there's a Swords at the Factory. We are going to pump it, so he's going to go up to 17. Brian's going to 17 right there, and in come the Lions for 2 more, so down to 15. All right, and you can see here we're going to attempt to cast a Copy Artifact, although reminded that, there's no blue mana there. So the Copy Artifact is revealed there on Dan's side. Both players have a bit of a smile. No harm, no foul, and then onward we go. But because of that tap, Brian not able to draw a card just yet. There's an Underground Sea on Brian's side. And what's Dan have to back this up? That Maze of Ith can protect him once we have that. So here the Lion's coming in again. Factory off the table after the Swords. Now we try to cast a Copy Artifact, and that one is quickly mana drained. So now we're going to have a draw. 2 mana there in the main phase. There's another Factory. And here is a tapping for 1, 2, 3, 3, 4. He's got a Icy Manipulator now, still 2 colorless. There's 3 more, 4 more, and a Draw the Book. So a lot of action there. So casting an Icy and drawing with the Book all in the first main phase there, using the Icy to tap the Lions and going on into Dan's turn. That was during the upkeep. So Dan's got another Lion down, so still more pressure. We have another Factory on that side, but another Swords or Disenchant could take care of that. We'll see if Brian's able to draw into any other answers here. Brian tapping 5, 6. Here comes a Trike. So that is big trouble with Lions on the board. And Brian is just going to you can put 1 counter on the Trike to start things out, saying, yeah, we're going to go ahead and take care of both of those Lions right now and leave me with a 2-2. So, yeah, that's a big card advantage swing right there for Brian, because he's at 6 mana. He ends up with 2 lions in the graveyard and a 2/2 on the board with an active factory as well. So the maze can protect Dan a little bit, but Brian is going to be able to come over top of it. Dan taking a look, seeing what can happen, and passes the turn back. So not a big follow-up play to that trike. I'm sure Dan would have loved to have a better play to take care of something there, but we'll see how aggressive Brian wants to get. So we are activating the factory and attacking for 4. Dan glanced at the hand. He's going to use the maze to sends back the trike, and he's going to take 2 from the factory coming in, okay? All right, and we go to untap. Looks like the tropical island is being tapped in the upkeep to keep off the blue mana. And there's a Felwar Stone. So blue mana is back on the menu for Dan. All right, and pass it right back to Brian. Brian's going to draw a card. He does have that active book now, so the card advantage engine is churning in Brian's favor currently. He has a mana advantage, and he has the card draw advantage as well. There's a Demonic Tutor. And his Ancestral is already in the graveyard, so I'm not sure exactly what Brian could be looking for here. Another Trike for more pressure, possibly, to try to speed that clock up. Maybe another control card, another counterspell, possibly, if he has another one. The Mana Drain is already in the graveyard for Brian. I'm not sure if there's more counterspells in there. All right, so we have an activation and an attack, and so it's going to be just for 2. With the factory, goes to 16. So Brian evening things up after early pressure from Dan with those lions. Brian is able to now start chipping away at Dan's life total. Let's see if Dan's going to have to come up with an answer here for the pressure that's now on Brian's side. Let's see what Dan finds. And he's going to pass the turn. So Brian, end step, is going to just continue to grind that card advantage out, continue to read that book, and churn it out a little bit more every turn. And we all know that those books can eventually just win you a game if they're allowed to stay online for long enough. So there's 2 more damage. We're now at 14-13. Here comes another big artifact, and that is the Trike, possibly the Demonic Tutor target. So that would be Brian's choice to maybe put some more pressure on Dan. Probably not a bad play in an advantaged position like this to just increase the pressure. Because guessing with white available to Dan, and we've seen swords already, that we're going to have access to some number of disenchants and other swords and some other removal cards. Here's a balance, so that is a big play right there, and a counterspell. So maybe that was the target, because balance would be one of the ways that he could get out of this one. So a timely counterspell there for a balance. Dan plays down an Altered City of Brass right there. It's a very nice... Dan has some cool Altered City of Brasses if you check out the deck photos on the Rocky Mountain Yetis Tournament Report website, which is linked in the description below. So that was a very, very timely counterspell. Sometimes that can be hard to hold those counters for just the right moment. But I would say that was definitely the right moment. That was going to knock out both of his Trikes. And his Trikes, remember, have 4 damage just sitting on them right now. So here we have a recall for 2, it looks like, discarding a City of Brass and a Underground Sea. We're going to grab the Ancestral and a Counterspell. Both pretty good choices. This is a mana burn format. So Mana Drain, not always the best move, as Corey learned, as I learned in the first round. All right, so here we have a tap of the Maze of Ith and then a big attack with the Trikes, attacking for 6, it looks like. Yep, and he is going to take 6. Dan's going to go down to 8. So that may have been the thinking for Brian to grab the Counterspell in lieu of a Mana Drain. Right now, mana is not really a shortage for Brian. And the risk of mana burn is a little bit lower, but right there, he's got enough damage on the board with the attack of the Trikes and then the arms on the Trikes to shoot for the rest. Dan says, didn't find an answer, let's go to game number 2. So Brian was able to turn things around pretty quickly there. After a few rounds of pressure from the Lions, Brian is able to come over the top of that maze. He had a card draw engine that helped him out, and unfortunately, Dan seemed to be drawing dead a little bit there for a few rounds during Brian's timely draws of some of those big creatures. So Dan is going to be looking to his sideboard for some answers. Let's see what Brian and Dan find for game number 2. And after sideboards, it will be Dan on the play. Brian will be on the draw. Both players taking a look at their hand. Let's see what happened in sideboard. Dan does have Titania's Songs in this deck. I'm wondering if those are gone because Brian running some potent artifacts in his own deck. Probably some artifact removal going in on Dan's side. But let's get started. Dan says Mishra's Factory and let's go. Brian takes a look at his first 7 plus his first draw. Comes down with, not too bad start, a Tundra and a Soul Ring. Let's see if Dan will go to put some pressure on attack with that factory while Brian is vulnerable, or if he will play out a spell. It is a Felwar Stone, it looks like, and tapping the Felwar Stone for blue mana and the Ancestral Recall. Good play, Dan. I would have gone that way as well. Nice play there. So, card advantage on Dan's side already on the play, and pretty good advantage on board as well. He's got a threat, and he's got plenty of mana to do a lot of his early game activities, whatever he needs to do. So Brian has some catching up to do on board. Let's see what he has on his second turn. That's an Underground Sea, tapping the Soul Ring for a Demonic Tutor. So Demonic Tutor is going to resolve. 1 colorless mana is going to be floating right there. And I wonder what Brian is going to search up here. Second turn, he does find a card, and he's going to shuffle. So not passing the turn, that means he probably has a play yet to do this turn. He's got that colorless mana floating, don't forget. Deck is cut, and there's a Lotus and a huge Mind Twist. That's a Mind Twist for 4. So long to the card advantage of that Ancestral Recall. That is a Mind Twist for 4. Brian says, you can keep the 3 closest to me. You got a Factory, a Scrubland, a Copy Artifact, and a Tundra. Pardon me if I get Savannas and Scrublands confused here on this recording. That happens a lot, and especially with the lower light of the brewery here, I might get that mixed up. So anyway, you did find a good use for that colorless mana as part of a huge Mind Twist. Let's see what Dan has to come back from that. Disenchanting the Soul Ring, trying to go for the Mana Denial. So that could be effective here against Brian's deck, who has a lot of artifacts that need a lot of mana. Unfortunately, Brian does follow up with a Sapphire and then the Workshop into a Triskelion. So the Mana Denial, unfortunately, Brian has the perfect follow-up for it, which is huge mana-producing land. There's Dust to Dust targeting the Trike and the Sapphire. So Brian says, I'm going to shoot you for 2 and shoot the Trike for 1. So the Trike goes in the graveyard instead of going to exile. That means that Brian may have some graveyard plans. Let's see if that comes back to become important later on in the game. Dan takes the 2 damage from the Triskelion. Dust to Dust, probably a sweet sideboard card there. Great to take 2 artifacts out of the game. So Dan, on his side, still could be attacking with that factory. Isn't yet. He's going to play a Chaos Orb, try to activate it, and there's a Disenchant quickly from Brian. So it may have gone after that Workshop, but a quick Disenchant makes it a moot point. And it looks like Brian says draw go here, or he draw land go. All right, so both players with 4 permanents down. Mana-producing permanents, plenty of things to do with them. Regrowth here, targeting the Ancestral, and we're going to try to cast the Ancestral, and there's that counterspell. So Brian says, nope, you can regrow it, but you can't cast it. Unfortunately, that also means that he doesn't have the mana to activate that factory and attack in, so smart play on Brian to wait for him to cast the Ancestral before he counters. Brian does a draw, Time Walk. Go to the next turn, draw, and there's an Ancestral. Not a bad follow-up to the Time Walk. So Brian refilling the hand there. There's a Strip Mine from Brian's side, tapping 4 for an Icy Manipulator. That's a pretty solid play. And in the upkeep of Dan, Brian says, I will tap your factory. All right, proceed to your draw, sir. All right, so here we go. Icy is down for Brian again. That was very effective in game 1. Brian was able to keep control of the board with those ices. There is a Time Walk on Dan's side, and there Brian kind of flashes a counterspell to the camera. I don't think Dan saw it, but we saw it here. Just declines the counter on the Time Walk. Says, I think I can find a juicier target for that counterspell, and I don't have the mana for it right now anyway, because there's a Sarah Angel. That would have been a juicy target for the counterspell, but the Angel comes down. There's a book on Brian's side, and he is going to tap the Angel. So as long as he has that Icy on the board, he can keep that Angel at bay, and also can keep her off of defending as well if he does want to get offensive. Dan activates his factory for an attack. Brian quickly strip mines. Game's moving pretty quickly here now, despite the closed position. Both players playing rather quickly and going back and forth, passing back the turn. Brian taking a peek here to see what he wants to do. What's the follow-up here? He's got the possible card advantage engine in the book, but remember that workshop can only cast artifacts. It can't activate them, so he actually doesn't have 4 mana free to use the book. He does have 4 mana that he can cast a Suchi with. However, there's a quick Swords to Plowshares on the Suchi. Suchi, an interesting inclusion because the Suchi can give you mana burn in this format if you can't use the mana when it goes to the graveyard. That does not happen on a Swords because it goes to exile, but if a Suchi goes to the graveyard, 4 mana comes in, and that can burn you if you can't dump it somewhere. All right, so anyway, here we go. He plays a Maze of Ith on Dan's side and passes back to Brian. Brian keeps that Angel tapped down, and on Brian's side, he's going to draw and say pass. So the Angel tapped in the upkeep, and back to Brian. So Brian's still without the ability to use that book for card advantage. He goes to tap something, and there's a Divine Offering attempted on the Icy. And so it looks like he wasn't tapping, he was waiting till the upkeep. But the Divine Offering does not resolve. That's a counter. That may have been the counter that was flashed before. And on Dan's side, he just says, yep, go ahead. Plenty of mana on Dan's side. Let's see if Dan can come up with something good to do with that. Put some pressure on Brian. That Angel normally would be great, but that Icy is just doing work. He's keeping the Icy tapped to keep the Sarah Angel tapped. Brian was able to defend it once successfully. Actually, he lost the Triskelion and the Sapphire to the Dust to Dust. That was before the Icy came down. Maybe another Dust to Dust would be a good one. That'll take off 2 potent artifacts on Brian's side. Anyway, here's another Tundra from Brian. And Brian says, go ahead, keep your Angel tapped. Dan says, draw, and he is going to attempt. What's he going to go for? Here is 4/5 mana coming out. There is a big Mind Twist on Dan's side, and Dan sees, looks like a Workshop and a Recall and maybe a Relic Barrier. So nothing super, super huge in Brian's hand right there. So there is a Factory on his side. So it's 24-18 right now. Move quickly there. But yeah, the Mind Twist got 4 cards up, but none of them were super, super useful for what Brian wants to do right now. He wants to draw from that book. There's a Swords for the Angel, probably because he got his hand drained away. He senses that he better keep that Angel at bay in the exile zone so that his Icy can tap something else until the Icy gets blown up by a Disenchant or another Divine Offering. So I'm guessing Brian sensed that he was a little bit vulnerable to removal there. Now, Brian finally does have the book online, so the book is reading on end step, so that card advantage engine is now working for him. There's 4 mana and another Icy Manipulator, so that's pretty brutal right there. In the upkeep, he's going to tap the Factory, and he's going to keep the 4 mana up for another book read. It looks like that's the plan. On Dan's side, there's a Relic Barrier. So Relic Barrier is a nice answer. That can tap down the Ices. It can tap down the book to kind of force Brian to read it at less than ideal times, like upkeeps. Anyway, Brian does read the book on the way to his turn. He's got another Tundra there, and now he really would like mana because he's going to be trying to dedicate 4 mana every turn to drawing with that book, and he can still cast things with that Workshop. There's another Suchi. So here's some pressure on the board on his side, although the Suchi is vulnerable to the Relic Barrier. So in the upkeep of Dan, at the end step, he taps a Suchi with the Relic Barrier, and in the upkeep of Dan, he's going to tap the Relic Barrier, and I'm not sure what else he tapped there. Maybe he announced the Factory. Anyway, on Dan's side, Dan's going to go to his main phase, and there is a balance. Balance is huge right here, because remember, Suchi gives you 4 mana, and he's already tapped in the upkeep. That's what happened. He tapped the book in the upkeep for Brian, and so Brian can't use 4 mana to read the book. He's going to take 4 damage of mana burn from the Suchi going to the graveyard, and he's going to lose some lands as well. So he's going to lose his creature, he's going to lose 4 life, and he's going to lose a couple of the lands, and he's been really relying on those lands to draw with that book aggressively. So that was actually a really, really nice balance. And there he is. He is indicating that he had tapped that Factory. That's what happened in the upkeep. So in all of that action in the upkeep was the book got tapped, Brian read the book, he tapped the Relic Barrier and the Factory. Anyway, back over to Brian's turn. That was an active upkeep right there. Back to Brian's turn. He's got another Underground Sea, so some more mana back, returning to use the book. He wants to have 4 mana for the book and 2 mana for the Ices at least to kind of maintain his defenses and build that card advantage back up. In the upkeep of Dan, he's going to tap both Ices, and they are going to tap Looks like he's going to tap again the Relic Barrier and the Factory, and then in response, Dan's going to force the issue to tap the book. That's what's happening. So he's forcing him to use the Relic Barrier, and in turn, Dan is forcing Brian to use the book. It's a very complex position here, but I think you're following along if you're an experienced old school player. Brian taking a look at his graveyard. And both graveyards starting to stack up here as this game goes on. This one's a real squeaker, and both players plenty of life left, 22-20 here, because a couple of swords have given players some life. Brian tapping quite a bit. Brian pump faking a little bit with his mana. Instead, he's going to go for an Ivory Tower. So instead of playing out, he's going to just put an Ivory Tower down. I don't believe the Ivory Tower is online just yet, although with an active book it could be. So here we have, again, the same kind of upkeep action here. He's tapping the 2 factories, and in return, Dan is tapping the book, and Brian is reading the book. So just forcing all the mana to be tapped down. That means he's off of any counters right now that might be in his hand, because he's forced to read the book in his upkeep. So that's a solid play from Dan to have Brian completely tapped out. So Brian untaps here. It looks like doesn't reach for the dice, so I don't think he has enough cards for the tower, and he does continue to play out cards. So rather than sandbagging behind the tower, he is aggressively playing out. So here's another mana. He's going to read during the main phase. That was a Mox Jet. There's a disenchant for the Relic Barrier. That could be the reason why he's playing a little more aggressively, and now he's going to pass the turn and tap the factories in the upkeep. So instead of sandbagging back behind the Ivory Tower, he just goes aggressively to play out so that he can kind of force Dan's hand a little bit. Now, Dan has an Icy on his own side, so things could really get tappy here, even though the Relic Barrier is gone. Back on Brian's side, he's got all 4 Tundras, it looks like, are down on the board. Achievement unlocked there. Nice, Brian. All right, there is a Hymn to Torok that takes us Swords to Plowshares, just a single card. It's good. It's a good card to have out of the hand, though. It's a 1-for-1 swords, because there we have the trike. The trike's got the 3 counters, of course. And Brian, it looks like he has tapped himself out here. So I've got there's one Icy that's still up. He's going to use that in his upkeep, or in Dan's upkeep. And Dan is going to tap the book back. So he's going to tap maybe the Icy, and Dan taps the book back. So the Icy is tapped, and the book gets tapped back. The Trisk is tapped. Maybe it was the Trisk that was tapped. I apologize if I missed that. So anyway, Dan announces an attack with both factories. The Triskelion shoots 1 for 2. The other one gets through, so that is 22-18 now. I think I did miss that. Apologize about that. All right, anyway, here we go over to Brian's turn. He's got a 2-2 Triskelion. The Ivory Tower is still not online because Brian is continually playing cards out. He's pushing the issue here, although the book is giving him plenty of card advantage back. There is another workshop. So that one was lost. The first one was lost to the balance. Maybe he had another one in reserve. And here's another Suchi. So he has lost a couple of Suchis already here. There's a Suchi being tapped at the end step, because one Suchi was swordsed and one was lost to the balance. His Icy and his Maze are tapped in the upkeep for Dan. So Dan plays another Fellwar Stone down. It looks like he has no cards in hand and 22 life. Brian's going to untap. And now we might see some aggression on Brian's side. Let's see what we decide to do. He's going to draw in the main phase. And looks like we are going to attack. So it's just with the Suchi for 4, because the Icy and the Maze are tapped. So it is going to go to 18-18. Yep, that's 4 damage to Dan. And he's going to keep his Trike at home. And as he passes, it looks like end step we have a Trike being tapped. Or upkeep Trike being tapped. There's all the tap action in Dan's upkeep after untap. Okay, so Dan lights up a factory and comes in for 2. So now 18-16. Brian definitely has a bit of an advantage in creatures on board with the Triskelion and the active Suchi there. The active book also is giving him plenty of card advantage. There's another mana down and another factory down. So we have the Emerald and the factory coming in for 6 now. So that was a big hit. And looks like in the upkeep, we're going to do the same thing. So tapping maybe the Maze and the Icy during the upkeep. And then Dan is tapping back the factory. So just forcing the issue there. Dan plays down another, it's another Mox. Pearl is going to sacrifice the Lotus, although mana is kind of irrelevant for both players at this point, or becoming that way. So plenty of mana here, sacks the Lotus, taps a couple more, and there's Jasmine Boreal. Very cool. Love to see Jasmine Boreal. She's a 4/5, and she'll actually keep the Suchi at bay with a 4/5 body, so pretty awesome. I think that's the Fox in Titania's Fox that Dan's theme is. So Brian have to deal with Jasmine. If he wants to get through, he's going to have to deal with her first. So Brian takes a look. He's going to tap 4, and ooh, there's an Abyss. That will take care of Jasmine. Unfortunately, Dan's next upkeep. Too bad, too bad. And it looks like he's going to pass the turn and reach for, or is he going to attack here? Yeah, so he's lighting up and attacking. So before he passes, he's tapping the Jasmine and the factory. So he's tapping the blockers, and he goes in. So down to 4 life, and in the upkeep, unfortunately, Jasmine goes careening into the Abyss. So a lot of pressure on Brian's side. 4 life left for Dan. What can Dan do with those Ices keeping his blockers tapped? There's not a lot he can do. He can play down a Lions that will survive as a chump blocker through that Abyss. And end of turn, he does have 1 damage from the Triskelion, so that will take the Lion out. So the Triskelion is now just a 1/1. On Brian's turn, we have an untap. Brian's looking. He's going to tap. He's reaching for his Ices. So there's a Maze, there's a Factory, and those are the 2 targets of the tapping. And he's going to tap the Suchi. Dan's going to tap the Suchi going to combat. Lights up the Factory and attacks for 3, because we got 2 from the Factory, 1 from the Triskelion. And second main phase here is Brian. He's casting a Recall for 1. And he goes to the graveyard. Do you remember early in the game when he put that Triskelion in the graveyard during the Dust to Dust instead of going to exile? There's that Triskelion again. All those turns ago, that damage ends up being the damage that will be the last one. Dan scoops him up and says, "Nice games, Brian." That was an incredible finish, and proof that that play can be pretty awesome sometimes, because even if Dan had been at 3, that would have been the last 3 damage that Brian needed, and ended up just being 1, which would have been the same 1. But pretty cool to see that play really work out, and to kind of show you that in this game, choices you make early in the game can have very, very important and profound downstream effects. So as both players scoop up, they're cleaning up the sideboards. Dan goes to 2-2 here after round 4. Brian advances to 3-1 there with those workshops. So Brian takes it 2-0. Brian, again, will end up later on winning that Chaos Orb flipping competition. Pretty awesome to see. Both of these players had a great match right here. It was exciting for me to bring it to you. And next video that we have is going to be the final here from YETICON, round 5 for the championship game. So hope you stay tuned right here, and we will see you then.